Welcome to my channel, Whodunit channel.
The missing Laird's fortune. The wind came rolling down from the hills with the slow determination of an old sheepdog, nudging at chimneys, rattling signboards, and making the waters of Lochdubh wrinkle into 1,000 silver lines. The village itself seemed almost asleep beneath low clouds, its white cottages crouched together as though exchanging secrets against the weather. Constable Ewan Calder approved of mornings like this. Rain threatened but never quite committed itself. Tourists stayed indoors. Fishermen complained without expecting sympathy. Most importantly, nobody expected the village policeman to accomplish very much before lunch. Ewan sat on the weathered bench outside the harbour hotel with a mug of coffee, warming both hands. His black collie, Moss, lay stretched across the flagstones, one eye half open in case anyone carrying sausages happened to wander past. Mrs. Ferguson, who ran the hotel kitchen with military precision, leaned out the window. "You've been nursing that coffee for 40 minutes. It deserves appreciation. It deserves drinking. I'll get round to it." She sniffed. "Lazy. Aye. You've paperwork. It'll still be there. Phone messages. They'll still be there too." She disappeared, muttering something about government pensions. Ewan smiled into his coffee. People thought laziness was a flaw. In truth, it was camouflage. A constable who hurried attracted expectations. A constable who appeared permanently one nap away from retirement was invisible. Invisible people overheard conversations. Invisible people noticed who crossed the square twice in an hour. Invisible people learnt far more than busy ones. Moss lifted his head. A dark green Range Rover entered the village with all the delicacy of an invading army. It ignored the 20-mile-per-hour sign. It splashed through puddles. It stopped in the middle of the square instead of an actual parking place. 3 curtains twitched before the engine had died. "Visitor," Ewan murmured. Moss yawned. The driver's door opened. Out stepped a man who looked as though he'd dressed from the catalogue titled "How to Annoy Highland Villages." Camel overcoat. Expensive boots unsuitable for mud. Bright silk scarf. Hair too carefully arranged to survive 5 minutes of Highland wind. He surveyed the village with the expression of someone inspecting an inherited garden full of weeds. Mrs. McBride emerged from the post office carrying parcels. The newcomer stopped her. "I'm looking for someone in charge." She pointed at Ewan. "The policeman." The stranger looked disappointed. "No. Someone important." Mrs. McBride smiled with dangerous sweetness. "That's him." The man approached. "You the constable. I've been accused of it. I require directions." "To Dunbray House." Ewan pointed toward the northern hills. "Single road. Can't miss it." "I nearly did." "That's because you were driving too fast." The stranger blinked. "What? You passed the turning." "I certainly did not." "You certainly did." A silence settled. Villagers developed an astonishing talent for appearing accidentally nearby. The baker adjusted a display that required no adjustment. 2 fishermen paused beside empty lobster creels. An elderly widow suddenly found intense interest in a flower pot. Everyone listened. The stranger smiled without warmth. "My name is Adrian Blackwell." Nobody reacted. "I own Dunbray House now." That earned him attention. Old Mrs. Gunn crossed herself. The fishermen exchanged glances. Even Moss opened both eyes. The great house overlooking the loch had belonged to generations of the McRae family, until the last Laird died without children 2 years earlier. Since then it had stood empty, gathering ivy and ghost stories in equal measure. "So you're the new owner," Ewan said. "I paid enough. I dare say. I'm restoring the estate. Good luck. I'll modernize it." Several villagers frowned. "There'll be luxury lodges." More frowns. "A golf development." Someone actually gasped. "A private marina." The silence became positively theological. Mr. MacLeod the fisherman spoke at last. "Private? Naturally. The loch isn't." Blackwell gave a short laugh. "It soon will be economically useful." Mrs. McBride inhaled sharply. One did not describe a Highland loch as economically useful, unless actively trying to start a war. Ewan finished his coffee. "Roads that way." Blackwell stared. "That's all? You asked directions." "I expected local cooperation." "You've got directions." The newcomer climbed back into his vehicle. As he drove away, the village watched in collective disapproval. Only after the Range Rover vanished over the hill did conversation resume. Mrs. Ferguson marched from the hotel carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "I don't like him." "You've known him 2 minutes." "It was enough." The baker nodded. "He looked at my shop as though it had lower property values." The minister wandered over, hands clasped behind his back. A man unused to listening. "That's never fatal," Ewan observed. "No," said the minister. but it often leads people toward interesting mistakes. By afternoon, every version of Adrian Blackwell had already been invented. He was a London millionaire. He was bankrupt. He intended to demolish Dunbury House. He intended to turn it into a spa. He had bought the estate with hidden treasure in mind. He was secretly related to the Macraes. He had once insulted a duke. He had never eaten proper porridge. No two stories agreed except on one point. Nobody liked him. Ewan wandered through the village without appearing to ask questions. The trick, he had discovered years ago, was never to ask directly. People distrusted questions. They trusted comfortable silences. By the time dusk settled over the loch, he'd learnt that Blackwell had demanded exclusive fishing rights, argued with builders before they'd unloaded their tools, complained about mobile reception, and informed the hotel that their coffee was provincial. Mrs. Ferguson had refused to serve him dessert. This was considered entirely reasonable. That evening, mist drifted across the water, swallowing the shoreline until the loch seemed to vanish into the clouds. Lights glimmered from distant cottages. A lone owl called somewhere beyond the pine trees. Ewan stood outside the police cottage, with Moss sitting beside him. The village was settling into its usual peaceful rhythm, yet something nagged at him. Not about Adrian Blackwell himself. Men like that appeared everywhere. No, it was the estate. People had whispered for decades that the last Macrae Laird had hidden a fortune before his death. A cache of gold sovereigns, rare whiskey bonds, antique jewelry, or perhaps nothing more than old letters inflated into legend. Most dismissed it as another Highland tale to entertain visitors. But legends had curious lives. Sometimes they stayed buried. Sometimes they persuaded otherwise sensible people to behave very foolishly. As the wind strengthened over the dark water, Ewan found himself wondering why a wealthy outsider would spend such an extraordinary sum on an isolated, crumbling estate whose only dependable asset was spectacular scenery. He had the distinct feeling that Dunbury House had not yet surrendered its last secret, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, someone else was thinking about the missing Laird's fortune. They were thinking about it with considerably more urgency. The following morning arrived wrapped in a fine drizzle that blurred the hills into pale shapes and persuaded sensible people to linger over breakfast. The harbour lay quiet, save for the cries of gulls disputing a fish head, while smoke rose lazily from cottage chimneys. Ewan Calder had intended to spend the better part of the day repairing the hinge on the police station gate, a task that could comfortably occupy an hour or, if approached with sufficient care, most of the morning. His plans lasted exactly until old Duncan Fraser appeared, cap in hand, looking unusually unsettled. "I've lost 3 sheep," Duncan said. "Wandered. They always wander. So, they've wandered into Dunbury." Ewan looked up, and that new fellow threatened to shoot them. "He can't." "I told him that." "What did he say?" "He said lawyers could do things guns no longer could." Ewan sighed, fetched his waterproof coat, and whistled for Moss. The road to Dunbury House wound through heather and scattered birch before climbing toward the old estate. The mansion emerged from the mist like a forgotten fortress, its grey stone darkened by rain. Scaffolding hugged one wing, and delivery vans cluttered the drive. Builders moved about with the cautious expressions of men already regretting their employer. Adrian Blackwell stood beneath the portico, directing work with expansive gestures that suggested every inconvenience was a personal insult. When he noticed Ewan, his smile carried all the warmth of polished granite. "Constable, morning. I hope you've come to deal with the livestock." "I've come to make sure nobody's threatening them." Blackwell frowned. "Those animals damaged my lawn. They're sheep. They're destructive. They're sheep." The builder nearest the front steps coughed into his sleeve to disguise a laugh. Blackwell ignored him. "I've had enough of this village's attitude. Every tradesman arrives late. Every supplier has an excuse. The locals stare at me. They're curious. They're hostile. They're Highlanders," Ewan replied mildly. "Curiosity often looks the same." Blackwell opened his mouth to argue before thinking better of it. "Never mind. I've more important concerns." He beckoned Ewan inside. The entrance hall smelled of damp plaster, fresh timber, and old stone. Dust sheets covered antique furniture too heavy to remove. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors peered from smoke-darkened walls, their painted eyes following visitors with uncomfortable persistence. Blackwell led him into a library, where survey maps covered an enormous oak table. "I've discovered something." "So have I." Blackwell blinked. "What?" "You've terrible taste in wallpaper." The room still wore faded crimson paper, decorated with faded hunting scenes. Blackwell failed to appreciate the joke. He tapped one of the maps. The estate records don't match. In what way? The boundaries. Old maps often don't. No. Blackwell shook his head impatiently. There are missing references, missing storage buildings, cellars that appear on one plan and vanish on another. Ewan examined the papers without appearing especially interested. You've been searching. I've been restoring. You've been searching. Blackwell hesitated. There are family stories about the last Laird. Ewan said nothing. They say he concealed valuables before he died. So I've heard. I don't believe ghost stories. But Blackwell's voice lowered. I believe accounts ledgers. He produced a leather notebook. The estate sold timber, whiskey casks, grazing rights, and investments worth a considerable fortune. Yet when probate concluded, much of that wealth simply ceased to exist. It may have been spent. It wasn't. You sound certain. I've hired accountants. Ewan almost smiled. Sometimes wealthy men trusted accountants more than common sense. A shout interrupted them. One of the builders burst through the doorway. Mr. Blackwell! What now? You'd better come. Outside. Several workers had gathered near the western garden wall. An elderly stone well stood beneath tangled ivy. Fresh earth surrounded it. One laborer held a rusted iron box no larger than a suitcase. Blackwell's face lit with unmistakable excitement. I knew it. He hurried forward. The padlock had long ago surrendered to rust. With theatrical care, Blackwell lifted the lid. Inside lay nothing. No gold, no jewelry, only mold, damp straw, and several smooth stones. Silence settled over the gathering. One builder muttered, "That's disappointing." Another laughed outright. Blackwell slammed the lid shut. Someone emptied it. Perhaps, Ewan said. They found it before me. Or perhaps it was always empty. It wasn't. You don't know that. Blackwell rounded on him. You're enjoying this. A wee bit. The workers returned to their tasks, exchanging amused glances. As Ewan prepared to leave, an elderly woman approached from the rear gardens carrying a basket of weeds. Her waterproof coat had seen decades of service, and her lined face suggested she had observed more foolishness than most people could imagine. She nodded politely. Morning, Constable. Morning, Mrs. Beaton. She had served as housekeeper to the last Laird for nearly 30 years, before remaining on as caretaker after his death. Blackwell scarcely acknowledged her. I've no need of gardening today. She ignored him. Instead, she waited until he disappeared indoors before speaking quietly. He's digging in all the wrong places. Ewan glanced sideways. Oh? The old Laird used to say treasure hunters never looked where memories lived. What did he mean? If I knew, I'd have been rich years ago. She smiled faintly. But I can tell you something else. I'm listening. The last Laird wasn't frightened of thieves. No? He was frightened of one particular visitor. Who? Mrs. Beaton looked toward the house to make certain nobody was near enough to hear. I never learned the name. What did you see? Only this. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. 2 nights before he died, I heard him shouting in this very garden. At whom? A man. What were they arguing about? I couldn't hear everything. What did you hear? She closed her eyes, searching through years of memory. Just one sentence. Ewan waited. The fortune isn't yours, the Laird shouted. It never was. A gust of wind stirred the ivy along the old stone wall. When Ewan looked back toward the library windows, he caught sight of Adrian Blackwell standing behind the glass, watching them, not pretending otherwise. And when their eyes met, Blackwell slowly drew the curtain closed. Ewan did not mention the curtain to Mrs. Beaton. There was no point. A man watching a conversation from his own library was hardly a crime, though it was often a sign of nerves. He thanked her, gave Moss a quiet whistle, and began the walk back toward the village. The drizzle thickened into proper rain before they reached the crossroads. Moss trotted ahead, stopping now and then to inspect an interesting scent along the verge. Ewan, outwardly in no hurry, replayed every word Mrs. Beaton had spoken. The fortune isn't yours. It never was. It was an odd choice of words, not you'll never find it. Not leave my property alone. But it never was. That suggested the argument had not been over ownership of hidden money alone. Someone had believed they had a rightful claim. The distinction mattered. By the time the cottages of Lochdubh emerged through the rain, Ewan had almost convinced himself that the old housekeeper's memory was more valuable than the estate ledgers Blackwell treasured. The harbour hotel smelled of fresh bread, soup, and damp waterproof coats drying by the fire. Half the village seemed to have taken shelter inside. Mrs. Ferguson placed a steaming bowl of Cullen skink in front of Ewan, before he had even removed his jacket. "You look thoughtful. I'm eating. You can do both. I've tried. It slows me down," she snorted. As if anything could. Moss curled beneath the table, rewarded with a discreet scrap of smoked haddock from the kitchen. The conversation around the room drifted naturally toward Dunbury House. "They've started digging up the gardens. They're bound to ruin the roses. My cousin says there are tunnels beneath the old chapel. My uncle claimed there was Spanish gold. Your uncle claimed he'd once wrestled a stag. He nearly had. No, the stag nearly had him." Laughter rippled around the room. Ewan listened without appearing to do so. At the next table sat Malcolm Reed, the retired solicitor who had handled countless wills over 40 years. His hearing was poor, but his memory remained as sharp as broken glass. Ewan carried his coffee across the room. "Mind if I join you? If you've come to borrow money, I've forgotten where I keep it. I'm after information instead." "That's cheaper." Ewan settled into the chair. "You dealt with the McRae family." "Aye. The last Laird left no children. He left no close family at all. No cousins. Plenty of cousins. None inherited." Malcolm stirred his tea. "They expected to. What happened?" "The will was unusual." "How?" "The Laird left the estate to a charitable trust until the legal disputes ended, and they didn't. They dragged on for nearly 2 years, long enough for Blackwell to buy it." "Exactly." Ewan frowned. "Who contested the will?" Malcolm hesitated. "I shouldn't really say." "You've already decided to." The old solicitor smiled reluctantly. "There were 3 principal claimants." Ewan waited. "A distant niece in Canada, a nephew living in Edinburgh, and," Malcolm lowered his voice, "a man who insisted he was the Laird's illegitimate son." Ewan raised an eyebrow. "Was he?" "No evidence." "What became of him?" "He vanished." "Vanished?" "Stopped answering letters. Stopped attending hearings. Simply disappeared." Before Ewan could ask another question, the hotel door burst open. A gust of cold air swept through the room. Adrian Blackwell strode inside, dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor. Conversation died almost instantly. Mrs. Ferguson emerged from the kitchen with folded arms. "Lunch?" Blackwell glanced around the crowded room. "If that's the best you have." "It is. I'll manage. You'll have what everyone else is having. I don't eat smoked fish. Today you do." A few villagers hid smiles behind their mugs. Blackwell accepted a seat with visible reluctance. As Mrs. Ferguson disappeared into the kitchen, he noticed Malcolm Reed. "You." The solicitor looked up. "I understand you dealt with the estate." "I did. I'd like to examine every legal document." "They're no longer mine." "I'll pay." "They're still not mine." "I'll pay very well." Malcolm folded his newspaper with deliberate care. "My answer hasn't changed." Blackwell's jaw tightened. "You old people are extraordinarily difficult." The words landed heavily in the quiet room. Mrs. Ferguson returned carrying his lunch. She placed the bowl before him, with enough force to splash a little soup onto the table. "Eat before it gets cold." "I was speaking." "I know. You interrupted me." "I intended to." Blackwell stared at her, then around the room. No one came to his defense. Not one person. For the first time since arriving in Lochdubh, he looked less arrogant than isolated. He finished only 2 spoonfuls before pushing the bowl away and leaving without another word. The door slammed behind him. Only then did conversation resume. Mrs. Ferguson collected the untouched soup. "Waste of good haddock." Malcolm watched the rain-streaked window thoughtfully. "He's becoming desperate." "So it seems," Ewan said. "No," Malcolm replied quietly. "You misunderstand me." Ewan looked at him. "That man isn't searching because he's greedy." "What makes you say that?" "Because greedy men can wait." The solicitor's eyes remained fixed on the road leading toward Dunbury House. "He's searching because he believes someone else is about to find whatever he's looking for." A sudden crack of thunder rolled across the hills, rattling the hotel windows. Several villagers glanced toward the darkening sky. Then, far above the village, barely visible through the rain, a single flash of light flickered from an upper window of Dunbury House. It was followed by another. Then another. Not lightning. A lantern. Someone was signaling from inside the old mansion, and whoever stood at that window clearly believed someone out on the hills would understand the message. Ewan said nothing as the lantern flashed a 4th time before the light disappeared altogether. No one else in the hotel seemed to have noticed. The storm had drawn most eyes toward the rain rattling against the windows, and Mrs. Ferguson was loudly reminding 2 fishermen that wet boots belonged by the door, and nowhere else. Only Malcolm Reed was still watching the distant hill. "You saw it?" Ewan asked quietly. "I did." "Know what it means?" Malcolm slowly shook his head. No. But I know one thing. What's that? People don't send signals from lonely houses unless they're afraid of being overheard. That was reason enough. Ewan drained the last of his coffee, thanked Mrs. Hoshreys and Lionshridori Ferguson for the meal, and buttoned his waterproof coat. Moss was already waiting at the door, tail wagging with restrained enthusiasm. The collie had learned that whenever Ewan looked particularly unhurried, they were usually about to do something interesting. The climb toward Dunbury House was slower in the rain. Water ran in silver ribbons down the rutted track, while mist drifted between the pines. By the time the estate walls came into view, dusk had settled across the glen. The builders' vans were gone. Most of the windows stood dark. Only the library glowed with a warm amber light. Ewan avoided the front drive. Instead, he followed an old footpath Mrs. Beeton had once mentioned, winding behind the walled garden. It offered a clear view of the western side of the house without announcing his arrival. Moss suddenly froze. His ears pricked forward. "What is it, lad?" The dog sniffed the wet air, then padded toward a clump of rhododendrons. Hidden beneath the dripping branches lay fresh tire tracks, not from the large construction vehicles that used the main drive. These were narrow, recent. Someone had driven around the back of the estate where no ordinary visitor had any reason to go. Ewan crouched, running his fingers lightly through the mud. The rain had softened the edges but not erased them, hours old at most. He followed the tracks until they ended beside a weathered stone outbuilding with a sagging slate roof. The door stood slightly ajar. No light escaped from within. Moss? The collie stayed close as Ewan eased the door open. The building smelled of damp timber and engine oil. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with rusted tools, cracked flower pots, and broken fencing wire. Nothing remarkable. Then he noticed the floor. One section of the dust had been swept clean. Someone had dragged something heavy across the stone flags very recently. The scrape marks ended at the back wall. Ewan held his lantern higher. The wall itself appeared solid, yet one stone near the corner bore fresh scratches around its edges. He pressed against it. Nothing. He tried again, this time pushing sideways. With a low grinding sound, the stone shifted just enough to reveal an iron ring hidden behind it. "So that's your game," he murmured. The ring operated a concealed latch. A narrow door, almost invisible within the masonry, eased inward. Cold air drifted out. Beyond lay a flight of worn stone steps descending into darkness beneath Dunbury House. Old cellars, or something more. Before Ewan could decide whether to explore immediately, Moss gave a low, unmistakable growl, not toward the passage, toward the doorway behind them. Ewan turned. A figure stood outside in the rain, silhouetted against the fading evening. The stranger wore a long dark coat and a broad-brimmed hat pulled low over the face. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then the figure bolted. Ewan sprinted after them, boots slipping on the wet grass. The fleeing stranger knew the estate well, darting between ancient yews and over a crumbling stone wall, without hesitation. "Stop!" Ewan shouted. The only reply was the pounding of footsteps. He closed the distance. Just as he reached for the stranger's shoulder, the runner twisted sharply, sending both of them crashing into the muddy slope. The stranger wriggled free with surprising strength. A gloved hand struck Ewan across the face before the figure scrambled to their feet and vanished into the thick mist. By the time Ewan regained his footing, there was nothing to chase, only silence. And one object left behind in the struggle. Half buried in the mud lay a tarnished silver cufflink, engraved with an elaborate crest. Brushing away the dirt, Ewan recognized the design immediately. It was not Adrian Blackwell's. It was the ancient crest of the McRae family, the same crest carved above the entrance to Dunbury House. Someone connected to the old Laird's family had been hiding beneath the estate, or wanted everyone to believe they had. Ewan turned the cufflink over in his hand, as rainwater washed the last of the mud from its engraved crest. The silver was worn smooth around the edges, not polished but handled. Whatever story it belonged to had not begun that evening. Moss sniffed the ground where the stranger had disappeared, circling twice before setting off with quiet confidence along the edge of the woods. "Easy," Ewan murmured. The dog advanced a dozen yards, then stopped beside a narrow burn swollen by the rain. The scent ended there. The stranger had known enough to step into the running water before climbing the opposite bank. It was an old trick, but an effective one. "So you planned your escape?" Ewan looked back toward the outbuilding. The hidden passage would have to wait no longer. He returned to the concealed doorway, lit his lantern, and descended the worn stone steps. Moisture glistened on the walls. The air carried the smell of earth, old timber, and something else, paraffin. Someone had been using lamps down here. The staircase opened into a vaulted cellar supported by thick stone pillars. Wooden wine racks, long empty, lined one wall. Broken barrels lay scattered across the floor, and cobwebs draped the corners undisturbed. Not every corner. A narrow path had been cleared through the dust. Ewan followed it carefully, avoiding the temptation to hurry. Fresh footprints overlapped one another. At least 2 different pairs of boots had crossed the cellar recently. One set was broad and heavy, likely a man's work boots. The other was slimmer, with a smooth sole unlike anything a builder would wear. The trail ended at an old oak table. Resting upon it was a hurricane lantern, still faintly warm. Whoever had been there had left only minutes before. Beside the lantern sat an open notebook. Most of its pages were blank. The written ones contained nothing but dates. 6 of them. Each date had a short line beside it. North wall, old chapel, dry well, library hearth, orchard. The final entry had no note at all. Only tomorrow's date. Ewan slipped the notebook into his coat. A scrape echoed somewhere deeper within the cellar. He extinguished the lantern at once. Darkness swallowed everything. He stood perfectly still. Moss remained silent beside him, though the dog's ears were fixed toward the sound. Another scrape, then a muffled thud. Not footsteps, a door closing. By the time Ewan relit the lantern and crossed the cellar, he found only another passage leading upward. It emerged behind a loose panel in the library fireplace. He eased the panel open by an inch. The library beyond was occupied. Adrian Blackwell paced before the fire with a whiskey glass in one hand. He was not alone. A woman in a tailored navy coat stood opposite him. She appeared to be in her early 40s, composed despite Blackwell's obvious agitation. "You promised me it would be found," Blackwell snapped. "I promised no such thing. You said the records were accurate. I said they existed. They've led me to empty boxes and blocked passages. Then perhaps you're looking for the wrong thing. I paid you to prevent surprises." The woman smiled faintly. "No one can prevent history, Mr. Blackwell." Blackwell drained his glass. "You haven't told the police, have you? The local constable?" "Yes, I've barely spoken to him." "You'd better not." The woman picked up her handbag. "I've spent 20 years researching the McRae estate. If there truly is a missing fortune, I want the truth recorded." Blackwell's expression hardened. "I want what belongs to me." She regarded him steadily. "That's an interesting choice of words." Without another sentence, she crossed the room and left. Ewan waited until the front door closed, before slipping back into the hidden passage. He had no wish to explain how he had appeared from inside Blackwell's fireplace. Outside, the rain had eased to a mist. Mrs. Beeton was waiting near the garden gate, beneath a large umbrella, as though she had expected him. "You found the old cellar." "I did." She studied his face for a moment. "And now you've more questions than answers." "That happens." She nodded toward the house. "The lady who just left is Dr. Helena March. You know her? She came here years ago, long before Mr. Blackwell." "What was she studying?" "The McRae family papers." "Did she find anything?" Mrs. Beeton looked toward the dark outline of the mansion. "Only one thing that frightened the Laird." "What was that?" "He once told her that people kept searching for a fortune that didn't exist." Ewan frowned. "Then why hide it?" Mrs. Beeton gave a slow shake of her head. "He didn't say the fortune didn't exist." She paused. "He said people were searching for the wrong fortune." The words lingered in the cool night air. As Ewan looked back toward the silent house, he realized everyone had assumed the missing Laird's fortune meant gold, jewels, or forgotten banknotes. Not one of them had stopped to ask what the old Laird himself might have considered his greatest treasure. And if that treasure was something entirely different, someone was willing to lie, threaten, and perhaps even kill to keep it hidden. The morning broke clear for the first time in days. Sunlight spilled across the loch, turning the water into polished steel, and drawing half the village outdoors, as though everyone had been released from captivity. Nets were hung to dry, washing fluttered from garden lines, and conversations that had begun weeks ago resumed without anyone needing to remember where they had left off. Ewan crossed the square with Moss at his heels, exchanging nods but saying little. A policeman who asked too many questions on a fine morning soon found doors politely closing. Better to let the village talk around him. He found exactly what he expected at the post office. Murrag Sinclair, the postmistress, had already heard everything. "You're late," she said, sorting letters. "I didn't know there was a timetable." "There is for gossip." "I'm behind. Terribly." She lowered her voice, despite there being no one else in the shop. Mr. Blackwell received a visitor before dawn. A delivery. A gentleman. You saw him. I saw his motor car. Dark blue. Very expensive. Did he come into the village afterward? No. Left the way he came. Ewan nodded thoughtfully. Anything else? Morag smiled with quiet satisfaction. He wasn't expected. What makes you think that? Because Mr. Blackwell met him outside instead of inviting him in. Could they have been discussing business? They were arguing. You heard them? I heard enough. What? The visitor kept saying. You promised there'd be proof. And Blackwell, he replied. I'm running out of time. Morag pushed a bundle of letters toward him. One of these is for Dunbray House. Ewan glanced at the envelope. The sender's address belonged to a firm of genealogists in Edinburgh. Interesting. Very interesting. Rather than take the letter directly to the estate, Ewan chose the slower road along the kirkyard. It wasn't actually shorter, but it offered opportunities. Old Angus MacRae was trimming the churchyard hedge with deliberate care. Although nearly 80, Angus possessed an astonishing memory for family histories. Morning, Ewan called. Aye, you knew the last Laird well. I buried him. I meant before that. Angus rested both hands on his shears. We grew up together. Did he ever speak of hidden money? The old man laughed. Every visitor asked that. And your answer? He never cared much for money. What did he care about? The family name. Anything else? Angus considered. Truth. Truth? He'd rather lose an argument honestly than win it with a lie. Ewan thought of Blackwell's impatience. The two men could scarcely have been more different. There was one thing that always troubled him. What? Angus glanced toward Dunbray House, visible above the trees. He believed someone had altered the family records. What sort of records? The birth register. Ewan looked up sharply. Why would anyone do that? If a child appears where none existed, an inheritance changes. Angus nodded. And if a child disappears from the records, so does any claim. By midday, Ewan reached Dunbray House. The builders were gathered near the front steps, speaking in anxious whispers. Their foreman spotted him first. Constable, what is it? You'd better come. He led Ewan through the entrance hall and into the east wing. One of the upstairs bedrooms had been converted into Blackwell's temporary office. Ledgers lay scattered across the floor. Cabinets stood open. Every drawer had been emptied. Nothing appeared stolen. Everything appeared searched. Blackwell stood in the center of the room, white with anger. They've been here. So I see. They broke in. Any signs of forced entry? No. Then perhaps they had a key. Blackwell ignored the suggestion. They knew exactly what they wanted. What was missing? He hesitated. I'm not entirely sure. You don't know. I haven't finished checking. Ewan wandered slowly around the room. A smashed picture frame lay beneath the desk. The photograph inside showed the mansion decades earlier. The last Laird stood beside an elegant woman and a boy of perhaps 12 years old. The glass had cracked directly across the child's face. Ewan picked up the picture. I didn't know the Laird had children. He didn't. So who is the boy? Blackwell frowned. I assumed a nephew. Did you? Before Blackwell could answer, Mrs. Beaton appeared in the doorway carrying a dustpan. She saw the photograph and stopped. Her face lost all color. Where did you find that? On the floor. She took the picture with trembling hands. I thought every copy had been destroyed. Blackwell looked between them. Who is the child? Mrs. Beaton said nothing. Mrs. Beaton, still silence. At last she whispered. His name was Jamie. Jamie who? She closed her eyes. Jamie MacRae. Blackwell stared. That's impossible. No. She replied softly. Only forgotten. The room fell silent. Ewan watched both of them carefully. Blackwell looked genuinely stunned. Mrs. Beaton looked frightened. Neither reaction felt rehearsed. Before Ewan could ask another question, a builder came running along the corridor. Constable! What now? You'd better get outside. Why? The builder swallowed hard. We've found someone. A crowd had gathered beside the dry well where the empty iron chest had been uncovered 2 days earlier. At the bottom, half concealed beneath freshly disturbed earth, lay the body of a man in an expensive dark overcoat. His hat had fallen beside him. His neck rested at an impossible angle. Ewan recognized him immediately. He was the mysterious visitor Morag Sinclair had seen arriving before dawn. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide him, and unless Ewan was mistaken, the murder had been committed only hours after that secret meeting with Adrian Blackwell. Ewan held up a hand before anyone climbed into the well. Nobody moves. The builders froze where they stood. A few removed their caps. Others stared down in uneasy silence, as though hoping the figure below would somehow prove to be a trick of the light. Blackwell arrived moments later, pushing through the gathering crowd. "What is all this?" No one answered. Then he looked into the well. The color drained from his face. For a fleeting instant, so brief that anyone blinking might have missed it, recognition flashed across his features. "You know him," Ewan said quietly. Blackwell hesitated. "I've seen him. His name? I don't remember. You met him yesterday." "I meet many people." "You argued with him." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm asking questions. And I'm declining to answer until my solicitor arrives." Ewan gave a small shrug. "That's your privilege." Outwardly, he seemed almost indifferent. Inwardly, he had already made note of Blackwell's first instinct. Not shock, not grief, not curiosity, but legal protection. That told its own story. By late afternoon, the body had been recovered and taken to the village hall, the coolest building available until officers from the county headquarters could arrive. The doctor, summoned from the neighboring town, completed only a brief examination before seeking out Ewan. "He's been dead less than 12 hours. So sometime before dawn. Likely. What killed him? A heavy blow to the back of the head. The broken neck came afterward, either from the fall or to make the fall appear accidental. No sign he climbed into the well himself. None." The doctor removed his spectacles. "He was dead before he went over the edge." Ewan thanked him. Murder, not misadventure. The distinction would matter greatly once the detectives from headquarters appeared. That evening the village buzzed with speculation. The Harbour Hotel was fuller than Ewan had ever seen it outside the summer season. Every table hosted its own theory. "He caught a burglar." "No, he was one." "It'll be smugglers." "It always is in stories." Mrs. Ferguson silenced the loudest argument by depositing a fresh loaf of bread in the middle of the room. "If any of you solved crimes as quickly as you invent them, we'd have no need of policemen." She glanced at Ewan. "Not that ours is overworked. I've had a busy day." "You walked about." "I walked purposefully." She rolled her eyes. Moss accepted a crust of bread from an elderly fisherman who insisted dogs appreciated good company more than good food. Ewan carried his coffee to the quiet corner, where Malcolm Reed was reading the evening paper. "Any luck identifying the dead man?" Malcolm asked. "Not yet." "The face familiar?" "No." "The clothes?" "Very expensive." Malcolm folded the newspaper. "Did he wear a signet ring?" Ewan looked up. "He did." "Right hand?" "Yes." "What makes you ask?" "I think I met him once." "When?" "About 3 years ago." "Here?" "No. Inverness." "What was he doing?" "He introduced himself as a private investigator." That caught Ewan's attention. A private investigator? He specialized in tracing missing heirs. Ewan's coffee suddenly seemed much less interesting than the conversation. "Did he give a name?" Malcolm frowned. "I only recall the initials." "Which were?" "DH." Darkness had settled by the time Ewan reached the police cottage. A telegram awaited him beneath the door. He unfolded it beneath the lamp. "Identity confirmed. Deceased is Daniel Hawthorne, licensed private enquiry agent. Last known client Adrian Blackwell." Ewan read it twice. So Blackwell had lied. Not merely by omission, directly. He had claimed barely to know the dead man. In truth, he had hired him. The following morning brought exactly what Ewan had hoped to avoid. 2 police cars roared into Lochdubh, scattering chickens from the road and bringing half the village to their windows. Detective Chief Inspector Gordon Strachan climbed out first. He was broad-shouldered, red-faced, and wore the permanent expression of a man personally offended by the existence of other people. He surveyed the sleepy village with open contempt. "So this," he declared loudly, "is where the excitement's been hiding." His detective sergeant handed him a notebook. "Local constables waiting, sir." Strachan spotted Ewan approaching with Moss at his side. Morning. You've managed to acquire another murder." "I didn't acquire it. It happened in your patch. I've been trying to discourage that." Strachan ignored the remark. "What have you got?" "A dead investigator. Hired by Adrian Blackwell." "Nonsense. I've confirmation." "Then Blackwell did it." Ewan blinked. "That seems rather quick." "It's obvious. It often is." Strachan jabbed a finger toward Dunbury House. "We'll arrest him before lunch." Ewan looked past the inspector toward the hills, where the old mansion stood against a sky of gathering clouds. He had learnt enough over the years to distrust anything that appeared obvious. Blackwell had certainly lied. He had certainly concealed his connection to Daniel Hawthorne, but one question refused to leave Ewan's mind. If Blackwell had hired Hawthorne to uncover the truth about the McRae inheritance, why kill the very man who might have found it? Unless Hawthorne had discovered something far more dangerous than a missing fortune, and had arranged for someone else to receive it if anything happened to him. As if summoned by the thought, the village postmistress came hurrying across the square, waving a thick brown envelope. "Constable!" She was slightly out of breath. "This arrived by special courier. For me? No." She turned the envelope over. It was addressed to Daniel Hawthorne. On the front, in neat black ink, someone had added a second line in a different hand. "If I am dead, give this to the local constable. He listens before he decides." Ewan accepted the envelope without opening it immediately. Inspector Strachan noticed. "Well, it was addressed to the victim. He's beyond reading it. He left instructions. I don't care if he left a shopping list." Strachan held out his hand. "Evidence." Ewan looked at the brown paper wrapper. The seal was unbroken, but Daniel Hawthorne's handwriting on the front was steady and deliberate. This had been prepared before his death, not scribbled in panic. "It's addressed to me now," Ewan said evenly. "It's addressed to the investigation. I am the investigation." For another 5 minutes. Several villagers, pretending not to watch, had become deeply interested in the bakery window. Ewan handed over the envelope. Strachan tore it open with unnecessary force. Inside were 3 items: a folded letter, a small brass key with a faded paper tag, and an old black and white photograph. The inspector glanced at the letter. 3 pages. He tossed it to Ewan. "You read it. You just said it was evidence. I changed my mind. Tell me if there's anything useful." Ewan hid a faint smile. Strachan's impatience was as dependable as the tide. He unfolded the letter. "Constable, if this reaches you, my work has ended badly. Mr. Adrian Blackwell employed me to establish whether any legitimate heir to the McRae estate still existed. He represented the matter as a straightforward question of genealogy. It was not. Within a week I became convinced that someone had altered parish records, legal correspondence, and private family papers over many years. The alterations all served one purpose: to erase the existence of a child named Jamie McRae. I cannot yet prove who arranged this deception. However, I have proved something else. Jamie McRae did not die in childhood, as local rumor claims. He lived. If he lived, his descendants may also live. The enclosed key belongs to Safe Deposit Box 17 at the Bank of Inverness. Inside are certified copies of every document I recovered before the originals began disappearing. Do not trust appearances. The person searching hardest for the missing fortune may not be searching for money at all. One final warning. Someone else knows the truth. They have already tried to buy my silence. When that failed, I believe they decided on something permanent. Daniel Hawthorne. Silence followed. Even Strachan read the letter a second time. "So," the inspector muttered, "we're chasing an inheritance dispute." Ewan folded the pages carefully. "I think we're chasing whoever wanted an entire branch of a family erased." "Same thing." "Not quite." Strachan pocketed the brass key. "I'll have someone collect this deposit box." Ewan's eyes lingered on the key. If the murderer knows about it, they'll be thinking exactly the same. The photograph proved equally interesting. It showed the front steps of Dunbury House on a summer afternoon decades earlier. The last Laird stood in the centre. Mrs. Beaton, much younger then, stood beside him. A gardener held a wheelbarrow in the background. Near the edge of the picture, almost hidden by the shadow of a stone pillar, was a boy of 12, Jamie. On the back of the photograph, Hawthorne had written a single sentence: "The answer is not the boy. Look at the man watching him." Ewan turned the picture over again. He ignored Jamie. Instead, he studied every face. Most were smiling toward the camera. One was not. Half concealed behind an open doorway stood another man. Only part of his face was visible. He wasn't looking at the photographer. He was looking directly at Jamie. His expression was impossible to mistake. It was not affection. It was fear. By mid-afternoon, Ewan and Strachan were questioning anyone still alive who had worked at Dunbury House 30 years earlier. Most remembered little. Time had softened details into anecdotes, but old Angus McRae did not hesitate. He peered at the enlarged photograph through thick spectacles. "That's Robert Kincaid." "The estate factor?" Ewan asked. "Aye." "What was he like?" Angus gave a dry laugh. "If honesty were whiskey, Robert would have died sober. He managed the estate finances. He managed everything." "What became of him?" "He disappeared." "When?" "About a month after the Laird died. Without explanation, he resigned." "And went where?" No one knew. Strachan scribbled in his notebook. So Kincaid forged records, stole money, and ran. Angus frowned. That's not what I said. It's close enough. No, Angus replied firmly. I said he disappeared. The distinction struck Ewan immediately. People resigned. People emigrated. People vanished. They did not all mean the same thing. That evening, Ewan returned alone to Dunbury House. Mrs. Beeton admitted him without surprise. I thought you'd come. I've more questions. You always do. She led him into the old library. The fire crackled softly. Outside, rain tapped against the tall windows once more. Ewan laid the photograph on the table. She stared at it for a long time. I haven't seen this in years. Who's the man in the doorway? She answered without looking up. Robert Kincaid. Did he hate Jamie? She slowly shook her head. No. He looks frightened. He was. Of whom? Mrs. Beeton's hands tightened around the edge of the table. The Laird. Ewan blinked. The Laird. He'd discovered something. What? He told Robert there would be a reckoning. For what? Mrs. Beeton closed her eyes. For 20 years of lies. Before Ewan could ask another question, a tremendous crash echoed through the house. Glass shattered somewhere downstairs. Moss sprang to his feet, barking furiously. Ewan ran into the hall just in time to see a dark figure disappearing through the broken French doors at the rear of the mansion. The intruder had come for something. When Ewan hurried back into the library, the photograph was still on the table. The letter was still in his pocket. But one thing had vanished. The brass key to Hawthorne's safe deposit box had disappeared from Inspector Strachan's evidence case, which had been left beside the library door only minutes before. Someone had risked breaking into an occupied house for a single, specific object. They knew exactly where the real answers were locked away. I can't help continue a story that is deliberately written to closely emulate MC Beeton's distinctive Hamish Macbeth series. If you'd like to keep developing this mystery, I can absolutely continue it while moving it further into its own original voice and style. For example, I can continue with Ewan Calder, Moss, Dunbury House, and the McCrae inheritance mystery as a fully original Highland detective novel. Here's the next installment in that original story. The shattered glass glittered across the flagstones like ice as Ewan stepped through the broken French doors. Beyond them, the kitchen garden sloped toward the orchard, its rows of ancient apple trees disappearing into a blanket of mist. Moss shot ahead, nose low to the ground. Easy, lad. The collie ignored him, following a scent across the damp grass. Ewan switched on his lantern, sweeping its beam over muddy footprints. The intruder had not attempted to hide them. They ran in a straight line toward the orchard, before splitting unexpectedly. He crouched. Not one person. Two. One pair of heavy boots. One lighter pair with narrow heels. Someone had arrived alone but left with help, or had met an accomplice in the darkness. A whistle sounded behind him. Inspector Strachan lumbered across the lawn with two detectives. Lost him already? We've got 2 sets of tracks. So the thief wasn't working alone. Strachan glanced briefly at the ground before dismissing it with a wave. One criminal leaves footprints. Another criminal leaves more footprints. Marvelous deduction. Ewan merely stood. Arguing with Strachan achieved little beyond increasing the inspector's blood pressure. One detective called from the orchard. Sir! They followed the voice. Halfway between the trees lay a leather satchel. Strachan picked it up and opened it. Empty. No key. Ewan took the satchel gently from him. It wasn't meant to carry the key. What then? He held the lantern inside. Tiny flakes of brittle paper clung to the lining. Documents. The thief emptied it. Not here. You know that how? Because there aren't enough scraps. Strachan frowned. What does that mean? It means the papers were removed carefully somewhere else. These are only what was left behind. For once, the inspector had no immediate retort. The following morning, Ewan boarded the first train south to Inverness. Moss remained with Mrs. Ferguson, who insisted the dog would receive a proper breakfast instead of whatever philosophical meals you feed him. The Bank of Inverness occupied an imposing granite building overlooking the river. Its manager, Margaret Sinclair, listened carefully as Ewan explained the situation. I'm afraid safe deposit box 17 was opened yesterday afternoon. By whom? She consulted the register. A gentleman presenting the correct key. My key. The original. Can you describe him? He was well dressed. Grey overcoat. Dark gloves. Name? He signed the register. She turned the book toward him. The signature read, Robert Kincaid. Ewan stared at the ink. That's impossible. So I understand. He died years ago. Mrs. Sinclair looked genuinely puzzled. He was very much alive yesterday. Less than an hour later, Ewan emerged onto the street carrying a certified copy of the register. The signature was elegant, confident, and almost certainly genuine. Either Robert Kincaid had survived decades in hiding, or someone knew his handwriting well enough to imitate it perfectly. As he crossed the bridge, an elderly newspaper seller called after him. "Inspector!" Ewan turned. The old man held up the morning edition. "You'll be wanting this." The front page carried no mention of the murder. Instead, a smaller article on page 3 caught his attention. Historic estate to announce major discovery. According to the report, Adrian Blackwell had invited journalists to Dunbury House the following afternoon for what he described as an announcement that will permanently settle questions surrounding the Macrae inheritance. Ewan folded the paper slowly. Blackwell could not possibly know what had been inside Hawthorne's deposit box, unless the missing documents had already reached him, or someone intended to convince the world they had. Either way, a public announcement meant every surviving witness, every hidden claimant, and quite possibly the murderer would be drawn to the estate at exactly the same time. For the first time since Daniel Hawthorne's death, Ewan felt the investigation beginning to tighten into a single knot. Whatever the Macrae family's true secret was, it would not remain buried much longer, and if the killer believed a carefully staged announcement would bring the mystery to an end, they were about to discover they had underestimated the quiet constable who preferred listening to talking. The following afternoon, Dunbury House had never been so crowded. Reporters clustered near the front steps with notebooks and cameras. Builders stood uneasily at the edge of the drive, while villagers gathered in small knots, pretending they had only come for a walk. Inspector Strachan strode about issuing orders with great confidence, convinced the day would end with Adrian Blackwell announcing the discovery of the missing Macrae fortune. Ewan arrived quietly with moss padding beside him. He noticed 3 things immediately. Blackwell looked exhausted rather than triumphant. Mrs. Beeton stood near the library door, watching the guests instead of the proceedings, and among the crowd was a grey-haired man in an ordinary tweed jacket who kept his hat pulled low and avoided everyone's eyes. Ewan recognized him from the bank register, or rather, he recognized the face that matched the old photograph. Robert Kincaid. Not dead, not missing. Waiting. Blackwell stepped onto the front steps. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today I intend to settle decades of speculation regarding the Macrae estate." Before he could continue, Ewan spoke. "I think it's time we settled something else first." Every head turned. Strachan frowned. "What are you doing?" "Finishing the investigation." "You haven't solved it." "I have." A murmur spread through the crowd. Ewan remained calm. The missing Laird's fortune was never a chest of gold. Blackwell stared at him. "You've no proof." "I do." He held up several certified documents that had arrived from the bank that morning after a second search of its records. Although the contents of safe deposit box 17 had been stolen, Daniel Hawthorne had wisely lodged duplicate copies with his solicitor. The fortune was an inheritance. Silence settled across the courtyard. The Macrae estate should have passed to Jamie Macrae. Mrs. Beeton lowered her head. The parish records were altered to erase his existence. Wills were challenged because someone knew the records were false. He turned toward the crowd. Jamie survived into adulthood. He married under another name and left descendants. Whoever proved that lineage would inherit the estate. Blackwell took a step forward. "I employed Hawthorne to find the truth." "I know. You've said as much. You also lied about knowing him." Blackwell looked away. "I lied because I feared I'd lose everything." "I believe you." Strachan blinked. "What?" Ewan continued. "You hired Hawthorne. He uncovered the truth. But before he could give it to you, someone else realized what he'd found." He looked directly at the grey-haired man standing near the back. "Mr. Kincaid." The man's shoulders stiffened. "I think you've been hiding long enough." Several detectives moved instinctively toward him. Kincaid sighed. "I wondered when you'd notice." "It wasn't the bank signature," Ewan said. "It was the photograph. Everyone thought you were watching Jamie with hatred. And you weren't." Kincaid smiled sadly. "I was afraid." "You knew someone wanted the boy erased." Kincaid nodded once. "I tried to protect him." "Then why disappear?" "Because I discovered who altered the records." The crowd remained utterly silent. "It wasn't the Laird." "No," Ewan agreed. "It was the Laird's younger brother." Gasps rippled through the villagers. Kincaid continued quietly. "He believed Jamie's birth would divide the estate. He bribed officials, destroyed records, and paid me to remain silent. You refused." "I did. So he framed you for the missing documents." Kincaid nodded again. "I fled before anyone believed I was responsible." Ewan's expression hardened. "But 30 years later, Someone learned you were still alive. Kincaid closed his eyes. Daniel Hawthorne found me. And told someone else. No. Ewan shook his head. Hawthorne never revealed your location willingly. He turned slowly toward Adrian Blackwell. You were desperate, but you weren't the murderer. Blackwell stared. Then who? Ewan faced Mrs. Beaton. You told me the Laird feared a reckoning. Tears filled her eyes. He did. You also knew Jamie survived. I promised never to tell. You kept that promise. She nodded. I did. Ewan's gaze shifted to the crowd, until it rested on another familiar face. Dr. Helena March. The historian stood perfectly still. You spent 20 years researching the McRae family. Yes. You discovered Jamie's descendants. I did. You also discovered Hawthorne had found Robert Kincaid. She said nothing. You believed that if Kincaid spoke publicly, your life's work would be credited to someone else. Hawthorne intended to reveal the truth before you could publish it. A long silence followed. Then Helena laughed once. Not with amusement. With resignation. I was so close. Blackwell stared at her in disbelief. You killed him? I only wanted the documents. And when he refused, he said the truth belonged to the family. Her composure finally cracked. I struck him once. She looked toward the old well. I never meant to kill him. But after he died, Ewan said quietly, you hid his body and stole the key. She gave the smallest nod. And when you learned duplicates might still exist, you broke into the house to recover them. Another nod. The detective stepped forward. This time Helena offered no resistance. As they led her away, she looked back toward Dunbray House. I spent 20 years preserving history. No, Ewan replied gently. You spent 20 years trying to own it. Several weeks later, the legal proceedings ended. The courts confirmed that Jamie McRae's granddaughter, a schoolteacher who had never imagined she possessed any connection to the estate, was the rightful heir. She announced that Dunbray House would remain open to the local community, restoring its gardens and archives, rather than turning it into a private development. Adrian Blackwell accepted the court's decision with weary dignity. He admitted his ambition had blinded him, but he had not been a murderer. Robert Kincaid, his name finally cleared, returned to the Highlands after decades away. For the first time in 30 years, he walked openly through the village without looking over his shoulder. Inspector Strachan received considerable praise from headquarters for overseeing the successful resolution of the McRae inheritance investigation. He accepted the congratulations with great satisfaction. He never noticed that every official report describing the crucial deductions had been written in such careful, understated language that they appeared almost obvious. Ewan had seen to that. Promotion never came. He was perfectly content. On a cool autumn evening, he sat once more outside the Harbour Hotel with a mug of coffee in his hands while Moss dozed at his feet. Mrs. Ferguson appeared in the doorway. No murders today? None so far. You look disappointed. I was thinking about fixing the station gate. It still squeaks. It does. So you'll finally repair it. Ewan looked thoughtfully at the weathered hinge. Perhaps next week. Mrs. Ferguson laughed. I should have known. The wind drifted gently across the loch, carrying the scent of pine and peat smoke. The village settled back into its familiar rhythm. Its secrets a little lighter than before. Ewan watched the evening sun fade behind the hills and smiled to himself. People often mistook patience for idleness. He had never found any reason to correct them.